Here we go. We are January 9th, 2023. This week's Parsha is Shmot, but we haven't met for the last couple of Parshiot for one or another reasons. And I wanted to explore this Parsha by, and also touch on the previous Parshiot as a way of kind of introducing ourselves to the book of Exodus. So it's almost a recapitulation of the story of Joseph as far as it relates to the opening chapters of Exodus that we find in this week's Parsha. And the theme that I want to follow is the theme of the relationship that God has with the patriarchs, namely, and specifically Jacob, the transition that occurs with God's relationship in the story of Joseph, and then it will end with the relationship that then begins with Moses. I think that this is a very interesting trajectory to follow, because one of the things that occurred to me as we were concluding the book of Genesis is that what makes Joseph such an interesting and problematic character is that he is not a patriarch, and the relationship that God has with him is different than that of the patriarchs, and we're left with a lot of questions as to why that is. Is it because the patriarchy ends with Jacob and that's the way it is, or is it because Joseph is Joseph? Joseph is exceptional and extraordinary as a human being with talent, but may not necessarily be that way as a person who is, let's just say, worthy of having that direct relationship. So I'm exploring all of these questions in the text itself, and the text gives us a lot of different clues. Now, I know that we're used to reading the Torah, especially with a kind of pietistic hue, in the sense that Joseph was a tzaddik, and Joseph was the recipient of the divine providence and all that, and that's the Torah really wants to convey to us that the story is happening because of a divine plan, but also because of human activities and human choices. And sometimes those are clear and sometimes they're not clear. Exactly where the line is between human freedom and divine providence, I think, is the central question in the whole Torah. It might even be the central question in human life, because after all, we sometimes use that frame to think about our own lives. We say, I'll use a fictional example, as the best example, which is Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof. It's like Matal meets which daughter, because God, it's a miracle, right? And like God, that's what God does. God ordains miracles, and that these miracles take place within the drama of human history. And so, that's what faith teaches us to do. But faith also teaches us to ask, where the line is between our choices and divine providence. And that's, I think, what it means to be a person of faith, is that you're always wondering, am I here because of my own choices, or am I here because of a certain destiny? And it's clear up until the end of Jacob's life that his life, as was his father and his grandfather, that was chosen by God. That the Torah makes very clear. Joseph, not so clear. But let's go into it now. We will do this. Here we go. So I call this God of Jacob, God of Joseph. What's the transition? I want to show you where God is with Joseph and ask why. So we first encounter God with Joseph in Potiphar's house. I have the Hebrew on the side, but for the sake of rhythm here, I will read the English. When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, a certain Egyptian Potifar, the courtier of Pharaoh, and his chief steward brought him before the Ishmaelites who were there. The Lord was with Joseph. Vayihi Adonai et Yosef. This is the really critical phrase. So you recall the brothers sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, Midianites. The Ishmaelites, Midianites sell him to Potifar. And it's in Potiphar's household that Joseph is successful. Vayihi Adonai et Yosef. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. So it's ambiguous here whether it's Joseph was successful or the chief steward was successful. We'll leave that. That's a good interpretive question. He stayed in the house of his Egyptian master. Vayar Adonav ki Adonai ito. When the master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord lent success to everything he undertook, and it goes on that everything was well. So what I have here is this idea that God is with Joseph. God is with Joseph. And what does it mean that God is with Joseph? It means that having been victimized by his brothers, having been brutalized, traumatized, and stripped of his clothing, humiliated, and then sold as a slave, Joseph has no power, and Joseph is there's no better word. He's a victim. He's a victim of their brutality, and God is with the victim. So when God, it's because what happens to Joseph is so unfair and so unearned. No matter how you look at Joseph, as bratty as he was, as snobby as he was, as snooty as he was, as annoying as he was, nothing is deserving of the punishment that he got. There was not a single thing that he did that was deserving of being brutalized like that and sold as a slave. So what you have here is human cruelty. I mean, what makes the story so difficult is, we can't believe that brothers would behave so cruelly to a brother, when in fact, we can't believe it because we don't see this, but it happens all the time. It happens all the time. And so what I'm saying here is that God being with Joseph is a small compensation for the wrong that Joseph experienced. And it's coming as compassion, coming as consolation. Joseph didn't deserve, I'm going to stop sharing here. Joseph didn't deserve what he got. And God is with him because he suffered. I mean, I don't want to give, it sound too Christological here, but it's not. It's actually Isaiah. Later on, we'll pick this up, and the Christians took it from Isaiah, but not to go too far down this way, but I would say, this is a big part of Jewish theology that I mean, I keep quoting the 23rd Psalm, which I think if you had to learn one Psalm, you learn the 23rd Psalm. That pretty much crystallizes all of faith and all of the religious posture. And at the core of the 23rd Psalm is the phrase, Adonai imadi, Ata imadi, you are with me, right? So it's, Gam ki elech begeit salmavet lo irara ki ata imadi. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, whatever that means, and the commentaries are all over the place on that, what that word means, and if it's a word or if it's a corruption or whatever, but it means something bad, okay? Even though I walk through, and we now understand this, we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, even though we suffer terribly in life, Gam ki elech begeit salmavet lo irara, I will not fear evil, for you are with me. right? Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Da, 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 da. Right? We know what that psalm says. It says, I can endure the worst experiences imaginable just with the knowledge that you are with me. That is such a spiritual, I would say it's an expression of spiritual genius to say, or a spiritual reality, in the sense that the life of the spirit, the spiritual life, is a life that is lived with the acknowledgement that I may not understand those things that are so difficult or unanswerable in human experience. I will never understand why innocent people suffer. It is an unanswerable question. But the only thing that I will be able to do is endure that suffering, knowing that at least in my endurance of that suffering, God is with me. It's a very, I mean, it's a emotionally charged idea altogether. And I think that that's what's going on with Joseph. Here he's suffering. He's suffering in the household of Pharaoh, in Potifar. He's a slave. This being a slave is just one step up from death. It's the worst thing, part of human existence. And the consolation of that horrible human predicament that he was not responsible for, that he was victimized in achieving, is that God is with him. Okay, that God, Vayhi Adonai et Yosef, and not only that, that God, the theology here is that because God is with him, there's a kind of radiation outside, right? God is with him, and that has a blessing to everybody. And that I think is a remarkable biblical idea, that the sense of blessing radiates outward. It just as a kind of bow to kind of connect Abraham. God says to Abraham, "Veyeh bracha," you shall be a blessing. You shall be a blessing means that I'm going to kind of touch you. I'm going to, put the light on you, and that light is going to spread to the whole universe, or to those around you. So people will want to be around you the same way that people want to be around an infectiously good person, right? They want to connect with that goodness. I'm always looking for the right image, and unfortunately, this will sound too trivial. But you remember how the wonderful world of Disney, opens with Tinkerbell, touching, and turning everything on light, right? And I always think that's a good way to understand it. Is like, boom, you're touched, you're lit, you're ignited, and that light spreads to everybody. That's Abraham, and we get an echo of that, or a hint of that, with Joseph. That Joseph is with God, is with Joseph, and that radiates to everybody. Okay, I'm going to go on, because unless you have a question or a comment on this. All right, so here we go. Sharing the screen. That's item 1. Okay, now look what happens here. Joseph is in charge of the Potiphar's household. The Lord blessed his house for Joseph's sake, so that the blessing of the Lord was upon everything that he owned inside and out. We get that point. What happens? Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, and Joseph then protests. He says, how could I do this thing and sin before God? So he is aware of God, that there's a moral kind of code, and the moral code is I can't sleep with my master's wife, okay, at the very minimum, right? Joseph faces his temptation. Note that it's not Adonai, that might be significant, that it's Elohim, v'chatati Elohim, but we can't go into that, and that's, a lot of other biblical criticism. Joseph is aware that he has moral responsibility, and that's how he invokes God. But by listing this reason last, is this his priority reason or his excuse? In other words, he's so talking. He says, she's saying, sleep with me, sleep with me, sleep with me. And he's going, and then he goes, he talks and talks and talks and talks and talks. And the last thing that he says is, how can I sin before God? and I want to say, critically, that if he was if he was very pious, that would be the first thing he would say. He says, how can you ask me to do this? It's a sin. I can't do this. I can't do this. No, it's like he's telling himself he has to rehearse in his mind all the reasons and get strength from that. It may be a quibble here, but I'm saying that there's his relation. This is the thesis here. Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, they have direct experience with God. God speaks to them. Joseph doesn't. Joseph has to intone or assume what he may or may not have been taught by his father, maybe his grandfather. John, go ahead.
I think in the Torah, there's a trope at that point in the Torah showing that he's not sure what he wants to do. It's a moment.
Sure. Vayima'en is a shalshelet. It's a long note. And of course, those of us who comment on the way that the Torah is noted, in terms of its trope, like to point out that, maybe he wants to, maybe he doesn't want to. Maybe there's plenty of ambiguity in the text. And I think that part of that ambiguity centers on, well, what is his relationship with God? Now we know that the house is blessed because of him, and that following the theological line, that he's in a moment of despair and suffering, so God is with him, and so that there's blessing, okay? But faced with the moral conundrum, he ends up making the right decision, notwithstanding the fact that she also holds on to his clothing, okay? So while you could read this as a slam dunk that it's clear that he rebuffed her, you could also read it that, he had enough hesitation to at least, to at least raise the question, okay, shall we say. All right, go ahead, Ilana, we have to unmute, go ahead. Unmute yourself. Press the space bar. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if Potiphar's, is it Potifar? Yeah. If his wife, if she wasn't his wife, would Joseph be interested?
Well, Joseph. So this is such a great question. It goes to the whole question of Joseph's sexuality. It goes to the whole question of what is the sexuality of a slave, and all of that is a very, very important theme, not only in the Bible but also in terms of later literature. And one of the things that I would point to is that the minute that Joseph, comes out of jail and interprets Pharaoh's dreams, I don't have this text in quoted here, but Pharaoh marries him off to Osnat bat Potifar, the daughter of Potifar, who is the priest of On. Okay, basically the elite in Egypt, the religious elite. It would be, the high priest's daughter of Egypt. And why does he do this? He does it for two reasons. One, it's to give him a household. I think that would be nice. Three reasons. Two, it's to put him in the elite. And three, the third reason is to make him sexually inaccessible to the pharaonic household. By marrying Joseph off, he is not available to any of the women in the pharaonic household. I think that point is never made. I've never seen that point in any of the commentaries. And to me, it's clear, right? Why would it be clear? Because he's so good looking. He's such a catch. He's amazing. He is like, he's Elvis. That's why in the play they have Elvis being Joseph. Or sorry, Elvis is Pharaoh. I'm sorry, he's Elvis in the sense that there's so much sexual appeal in Joseph, and because he's just hugely talented. And by marrying him off, it's like he gets sequestered, and that's it, no more. And he knows that where the boundaries are. I think it's the marriage functions as the placement of sexual boundaries, notwithstanding the fact that, when did that ever work? Go ahead, Helene, and then John.
You hit it in your last statement. When did that ever work? They don't have just one wife in those days, right?
No, but I'm saying it works. It works for one reason, and that is because he is always going to be differentiated. The marriage of Joseph is intended to place him outside of the Pharaonic household. He will never be adopted by Pharaoh. He will never become an Egyptian. And it's Pharaoh's strategic imperative to keep him that way, because Pharaoh always needs to exploit him, and Pharaoh always needs the possibility of dispensing with him. That's my position on it. Stanley, go ahead.
So what I find interesting is and it goes back to something you said, the order in which Joseph gives reasons for not wanting to sleep with Potiphar's wife. And he ends with, it's a sin before God. But before that, he says, well, he's been so nice to me, as if he hadn't been nice to me, would have been all right. Or maybe I would have considered it.
Exactly.
So it's very transactional in terms of his thinking.
That's right. So it just, if you want to take a pietistic view of it, of course, it's the culminating thing. It reaches that. If you want to take a kind of more, I don't want to say cynical, but realistic view, maybe he's just using it as an excuse. Marlene Herman, I don't see your face, but I see your hand. I don't hear your voice. Marlene Herman, are you there? Okay. I'm not hearing you. We got to go on then. If not, if you want to come back to it, come back to it. Okay. There you go. Did you? You there? You're there. Okay, let's go. Sorry. Okay, we now are in jail with Joseph, and again, God is with Joseph in jail, and this follows my line that God is, Joseph in the end. Okay, so he may have been tempted by Potifar, but in the end he didn't, and in the end he was jailed, and is jailed wrongly. Okay, and the fact that God is with him, and the text goes in its way to say Bashir Adonai Ito in jail, is only a conveys the idea once again that in the state of victimization, God is with him. Now let's turn to this moment. Okay, this seems to be a moment of transition. Because when the wine steward and the baker come before Joseph, Joseph kind of notices that they're depressed, and they say, "Chalam chalamnu, we dreamed a dream. We had dreams. We have no one to interpret them." So Joseph said to them, "Halo le'Elohim pitronim saprunali." Here it's translated as "surely God can interpret," but I want to take a much more literal translation, which is Le'Elohim pitronim, interpretations belong to God. Wait, interpretations belong to God, sapruna li, tell them to me. So what does this mean? What does this mean when he says interpretations belong to God, or God gives interpretations, tell me? There is a moment here where he's playing a game. Either he's saying, I have a divine power, or he's saying, look, I know you believe in this, and so I want you to think of me this way. And there is a moment where I mean, imagine, you're the baker, you're the wine steward, and you hear, well, we've dreamed a dream. So today, I'm going to a psychologist, right? Today I'd go to my psychologist or psychiatrist, and I would say, I dreamed a dream. And the psychiatrist would say, in part of the therapy would say, well, tell me about your dream. And then you would tell the dream. And then what would happen next in the therapy session, Stanley? if you had a client come to you and say, I'm troubled by my dream,
Yeah.
what would your next
Well,
question
what-
be?
I can tell you what I would do. I would
Yeah.
get the person's associations to the dream, namely,
Bingo.
what does it bring to mind, and what has happened during the day that might have tipped off the dream. These are two sort of standard things that you would want to help elaborate the dream,
Okay, but you would
or get to
never
the
say,
latent content.
you would never say, and I'm here assuming your training, you would never say interpretations are from God.
No, I would not say that.
Because what does that mean? It means that I have a direct link. I have a direct conduit to what God is revealing. In other words, there's a mindset here that God is using the dream as a vessel of communication to you, and that I, as the interpreter, the wise person, have access to that. And that's what he's saying here. That's what Joseph is saying here. And that's why it's an audacious claim. It's not really a humble claim. It's, when you read the prophets later on, even Moses, who's coming up in a few chapters, but think about Jeremiah and think about Jonah and think about all of the prophets, they're not very comfortable about being the vessels of God's word or God's name or God's message. They have a really rough time with it because it's tremendous responsibility. And it's not that they're humble people, although Moses is described in that way. It's that they would never boast of this, right? And here, when Joseph says this, to some readers, this would seem, well, of course, it's true, and I am endowed with this power. And some readers would say, that's quite an audacious claim. That's quite a boastful claim. In fact, that's amusingly arrogant as a claim. And so therefore, when he says it, he is invoking God, but again, is God speaking to him or not? And that's the question that the narrator, the text is playing with. Because the narrator never comes out and says, and God said to Joseph, never. You won't find it. All you'll find is, I think this is what God is saying, right? And that's a big, big difference. Okay, let me go on. All right. Surely God can interpret your dreams. Now, Pharaoh, the same thing happens with Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. Now I have heard it said of you that for you to hear a dream is to tell its meaning. Joseph answered Pharaoh saying, not I, God will see to Pharaoh's welfare. Well, it's amazing, right? So when Joseph makes this claim, Yaneh Elohim Yaneh Shlom Paro, what does it mean? So is he saying, I have prophetic power? Or here I'm saying, is he taking advantage of Pharaoh's vulnerability? Okay. And here I want to stop with that question because what's interesting, and everybody kind of is I don't see any.
He's coming back.
Yeah, wow. This well, when you have shaky internet, that's it. So my question was, once again, we'll do this. That is he taking advantage of the vulnerability of Pharaoh? And I'm going to say yes, he is. Because why? Here's a guy, Pharaoh. He's troubled. Okay, he's troubled that he had these dreams, and when you're troubled, anybody could take advantage of you, right? We have in town an astrologer, like a card reader, astrologer. I think we still do. I haven't walked near the pizza store, right next door. So you can walk down between 3rd and 2nd Avenue on Raritan Avenue, and if you were in a low moment, okay. And I'm not talking about any of us, of course, because we would never walk in there. Of course not. But it's conceivable that if you were depressed, or if you were uncertain, or if you needed some kind of advice and you didn't want to, make an appointment with a psychologist, and you just walked by, you had a pizza or some Thai food, and you say, I think I need to talk to someone. Or, maybe they have some insight that I don't know. And you're very vulnerable. Now, the charlatans in that profession take advantage of that. They absolutely take advantage of it because they'll find they're honed into what your vulnerability is, and they will exploit it, right? So what's someone's vulnerability? In the time of it was 100 or so years ago, Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, was into and Houdini also. They were very much into communicating with the dead, seances. This was very popular. And Houdini himself, who knew a thing or two about magic and manipulation, but was very, very interested in the spiritual occult world, and went out seeking charlatans to dupe them, because he wanted to communicate with his dead mother. And it's a fascinating little story. And so his own vulnerability was, that he missed his mother, and he wanted to communicate beyond to the beyond. Well, charlatans take advantage of that. So here I'm reading this, I'm going like, Joseph's just been in jail for 2 years. We know that he's incredibly smart. We know that he's incredibly talented. We know that he's brilliant, probably. And we know that he already has a lot of intuition into human behavior. He sees Pharaoh's vulnerability. I mean, it's clear to us, the guy can't sleep. He's been up all night with dreams. We see this. And so he sees it, and he says, and he knows the one thing that will communicate to Pharaoh in ancient Egypt is the spirits, and that Joseph is making a claim to God. So the question then is this a claim or is it real? And the text doesn't answer that for us. I'm left with that question. Is he manipulating, or does he really believe it? Now, again, the pietistic reading is, of course he believes it. Of course it is. It's a shanda that you're even asking the question. Apicorsis, that you're even questioning, the piety of Joseph. But reading the story and reading the context, you see he's a real person. He's got real, knowledge of human behavior. He's insightful, and he knows how to manipulate people. And of course, he's manipulated people from day one. Why wouldn't it be different here? And he's had 2 years to meditate on how to manipulate people. And he's manipulated the butler and the baker. I mean, why wouldn't he manipulate Pharaoh either? Okay, it seems to me that it's a slam dunk here. So when Joseph says to Pharaoh, Chalom paro echadhu et asher ha'elohim oseh higid Pharaoh, I put it in green here because he's making the statement, I have concluded that there's one dream. It's me. I have concluded it. God has told what Pharaoh is. So that's the clue. The clue is, I'm stating to you my first finding. My first finding is from me. But I will tell you, that is to say, aspire to convey to you what God is saying. And I, as a reader, catch this. I'm not sure if Pharaoh catches it, because Pharaoh is in a vulnerable state, right? And so he says, Hu adavar asher dibarti el Paro. It is just as I have told Paro. I am telling Paro. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. But I am telling you this, okay? So I have this power to tell you what God is saying. And you are listening because you need an occult. You need a spiritual direction. And I sense that, and I am going for that like I'm going for your Achilles heel. It is your vulnerable spot. And I'm going to take advantage to it as long as I can. And he's successful at it, okay? As for Pharaoh having the same dream twice, this is Joseph speaking, and he's discerning, and then he's conveying, it means that the matter has been determined by God, and that God will soon carry it out. How does he know this? How does he even know this? Again, pietistically, well, God speaks to him. Or, he's saying, look, I'm telling you this because I have an insight here. I have an insight here, and I have a gamble. This is the only shot I have. And I think this what makes the story great. Is that there's so much ambiguity here. He's only got one chance to get out of jail, and he has to use every single aspect of that chance. And if in that chance he can convey to Pharaoh that there is something of truth in this dream, then go for it. Now, again, the pietistic reading is that the dreams are prophecy and the dreams are a method of communication and all that, and we can accept that line of interpretation with which makes, which is a debate. I'm debating that line here. I'm debating against it. I'm saying that another line of interpretation is to see in Joseph a very, very shrewd, manipulative character altogether. Okay, and so that the use of God is that God may have been with Joseph as compassion, but now Joseph is using the idea of God for his own personal advancement. That's a really cynical claim, no? Okay, but in light of all sorts of politics, it may not be an untrue claim that people do use God for their own political advancement. Okay, enough said about that. All right. So Pharaoh's courtiers said, "Could we find another like him, a man in whom there is the Spirit of God?" And I say Pharaoh takes the bait here. He discerns that Joseph has divine power. Joseph never made that claim for himself. What I'm saying is that Pharaoh was so bamboozled by him, so in awe of Joseph, that he makes that conclusion. He says, there can't be any other reason. It's right. And the irony is not lost on us that for Pharaoh to attribute this to a higher power seems, I think, the height of irony, because Pharaoh in the Egyptian world is a god himself. So there's something peculiar about that, and I think the Torah is drawing us to that irony. Okay? Go on. So we go on. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, yet without you no one shall lift up a hand or foot in the land of Egypt." Just to remind you who's who. You have divine power, but I'm the human ruler. And here on earth, under me, I'm in charge. Okay, and that's the dynamic that exists between Pharaoh and Joseph. When Joseph names his son, he does invoke God. God has made me forget. Ki nashani Elohim. God, Hifrani Elohim bears his son. So he does invoke God in the name of his son. So I think he has a moment of nostalgia and a moment of I'm going to give him his moment of piety. Of course, it's a birth of a child, children. That's when he can invoke God. Okay, but then the brothers come down. Okay, and then you'll recall in the first scene, he locks them up and then he releases them. And then after 3 days, and he says, "Et Elohim ani yareh," I released you because I'm a God-fearing man, okay? And I'm going like, yeah, really? Earnest, or is it manipulation? Are you confused? What does it mean for this powerful person to say I am moral? It's a cognitive dissonance. I just locked you up and lied to you and framed you and accused you, but I'm gonna let you go because I'm moral. I'm moral, okay? Right? So that really shakes them up a lot. I'm going to zip through a few of these, okay? To his sons, when Jacob now speaks to his sons and says, "You got to go down, you got to go down," he says, "El Shaddai, may El Shaddai dispose the man toward mercy." And I'm saying here, note the dramatic irony here. When Jacob says, "May God dispose this man favorably toward you," Jacob doesn't know that it's Joseph. And Jacob doesn't know that Joseph is manipulating, and we know it, and God knows it, right? So it's all. I'll read what I wrote here. We note that it is not God who will dispose the man mercifully. Joseph knows that it is not God, and God knows what's going on here. How do you think God feels being dragged in under false pretense? It's a lie. And that Jacob is caught up in a lie, and it's all. And God is not powerful here. God is powerless here to change the course of these events. God doesn't intervene here. Jacob is invoking God in a way, in simplicity, thinking that this is what's happening, but something else is happening altogether. Okay. All right. So we arrived at the encampment with our bags, and this is when the brothers come a second time, and they reveal that they discovered the goblet and the money, And Joseph says something here, all is well, your God and your God of your father must have put the treasure in your bags for you. I got your payment. And he brought Shimon out to them. He's lying to them and using God in a lie. That's a sin, okay? And then he looks about and sees his brother, and then he makes a blessing to his brother. May God be gracious to you, my boy. In the light of the above, how do we relate to this blessing? Is he being earnest in this blessing, or is he still being manipulative? Okay. When Joseph says, when he reveals himself, he says, it was to save life that God sent me ahead to you. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth, right? And to save your lives and restore it. So it was not you who sent me here. I should have put this in yellow, but it was God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, a lord of all his household, and the whole ruler of Egypt. Look at what he's saying here. God has sent me, sent me. You didn't send me here. God sent me here. God made me Av to Pharaoh, Adon, master, Moshel, governor. What? Is this man a man of God talking? None of the patriarchs talk like this. Neither would Moses. Okay. So here I'm saying there's something about Joseph here in which the Lord, there's a continuity of his character from the beginning. He was always a bit snooty, always a bit full of bragging, and it's just now in a different guise. Whereas Jacob, you could argue, Jacob gets his comeuppance from Laban, and Jacob has to wrestle with Esau, and Jacob has extraordinary human and psychological challenges that while are not slavery, I mean, to experience the presumed loss of your child and the rape of your daughter and the death of your wife, we don't want to make, gradations and weigh out the weight of human suffering. But I would say that this man Jacob does go through quite a lot in life. Joseph spends 20 years in jail. That's different. That's a different kind of suffering. But Jacob's suffering changes him, I think. Joseph's suffering changes him a little, but not fundamentally. Okay, and we could have a nice debate about that. What I want to say is, so Bob, you're saying based on McHenry, Joseph, you're saying that the phrase Joseph and Tzaddik is a misnomer. I'm not saying it's a misnomer. I'm saying that you're entitled to that as a debatable proposition, and it is a debatable proposition, but there's a reason why that part, and that specifically the mystical part of the tradition, uses Joseph as a tzaddik, and that has to do with the presumption of resisting sexual temptation, at the very least. Okay, you're a tzaddik when you can resist that. Okay, and that's because the mystical tradition sees, has its issues with sexual temptation. Okay, now I'm going to just go when Jacob descends to Egypt. Israel set out with all that was his, came to Beersheba. He offered sacrifices to God of his father. So we notice, if we're keeping score, nobody after Jacob makes a sacrifice. Joseph doesn't sacrifice. Somehow the brothers don't offer sacrifices. Jacob is the last one in the book of Breshit to sacrifice. Even Moses later on won't sacrifice yet. Okay, and so God speaks to him in Marot Halayla, in a vision by night. Yaakov, and he says, Anochi ha'el Elohei avicha. I am the God of your father. Don't worry, because I'm going to make you a great nation there. Anochi ered imcha. I will go down with you. And that is, again, the statement of, it's a theological statement that there is some deprivation that will be experienced there, but I will be with you, and that will make it worthwhile. You'll be able to endure. Okay. When this was last week's parsha, Jacob makes Joseph take an oath. God is not present in the oath. Normally, you would swear by God's name, but God is, the name of God is conspicuously absent in the oath, and that's something worth studying. But we don't have the the time to look at it. When Jacob blesses the Joseph's sons, he invokes God by El Shaddai, which is the archaic form of God's name. You'll in 2 weeks we're going to have Parashat Va'era, in which God speaks to Moses and said, I revealed myself as El Shaddai. So El Shaddai is the antiquarian appellation of God, okay? And Jacob is invoking that. He's saying, I'm going back to the deep past, 100 years ago. Basically, that's what it was, or maybe less than that, where God revealed to me at Luz, and he blessed me, and he made you he said to me, you'll be fertile. He appeared to me, he never appeared to you, Joseph. He blessed me, but he never blessed you. He gave me the promise of the land, but he never gave. That's the difference. Joseph is not a patriarch because he never received those directly from God. What he does get is the transmission of those blessings, but they're transmitted by the human agent, namely his father, Jacob. So here, when Joseph introduces his sons, and the question as to exactly what's going on there, we can't get into. But when Jacob notices Joseph's sons, he asks him, "Who are these?" Mi ele. Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, Asher Natan li Elohim, whom God has given me." And I thought that's an interesting phrase. So on the one hand, again, it's nice. It's a pietistic statement, but he doesn't talk that way all the time. And so, I think it's human nature that when you're around, quote, pious or religious people, you behave a certain different way, right? And we all do that. I know that when I'm in a certain milieu, I can, talk in a different kind of language. When I'm in a less, spiritual, a less religious milieu, I talk one way, right? And so he's with his father. His father looks, an ancient bearded, Hebrew, and Joseph looks like a modern, shaven, wealthy Egyptian. And he's talking to his father. I'll use the analogy as he's talking to like a rebbe, right? And this is religious language, okay? That my sons whom God has given me, all right? And I say here, the very fact that I can ask whether or not there's genuine feeling in this is proof of the problem. I'm constantly asking, with Joseph, is it real or is he putting us on? Because he's always trying to manipulate the situation. Did Joseph ever invoke God upon seeing Israel? A religious person, I'll stop here for a second, and I would say, the way that we behave is much more religious than Joseph, okay? It's ironic, but it's true. How many people have I had up on the bima for a special birthday or a special anniversary or a special milestone, and we say the Shechianu, and we get all sentimental, and it's genuine. It's not put on. It's truly felt in the sense that I'm thankful for everything that I have in my life. It's a blessing, and my life is a blessing. I look at my life as a blessing, and I would say that when people experience these heightened moments in their lives, they take a step back, they get misty-eyed, they invoke a sense of gratitude, okay? None of that, zero, happens with Joseph. You would think that he would say, "Oh, Baruch Hashem, I saw my father," right? But the text doesn't have him say, the text has him weep, the text has him break down, the text has him go through all sorts of, different kinds of emotions, but it never says, "Thank God. Thank God I saw it." I find that completely fascinating, right? That in such a moment, a transformative moment, that the religious experience that normal person would have would be to invoke God, and that God is not there, right? Now, we could make all sorts of arguments about that, and that the Bible doesn't really talk that way, but the Bible actually does talk that way, because we're going to, meet Yitro in a couple of parshiot, and Yitro is going to say, Baruch Hashem, blessed be God. And we saw a character earlier on, who says thank you. And we saw Eliezer, we saw, all these Gentile characters in the Bible that thank God, that bless God. Eliezer, when all the things happen that he finds, that it's the servant, not necessarily Eliezer, but the unnamed servant of Abraham who finds Rebecca, and you would think that this is like the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay, he's so grateful. He invokes God. He thanks God. And Joseph here sees his father, and this moment. Then it's a moment where the father blesses the children, and you would think, maybe say a little Shechiara, maybe say a L'chaim at least. Wouldn't the text have some outlet to express some religious feeling? And it doesn't. And the fact that it's silent only for me raises a question that says, it's not that he's not, but that he is in a milieu where he has to watch himself all the time. And he needs to present himself as totally Egyptianized. And he needs to be aware the way that someone who is not necessarily secure in their own self and their own identity about how he presents himself. Notice, of course, Joseph in Egypt is not known as Joseph. He's not known with a Hebrew name. He's known by Tzofnat Paneach. Notice he has the Egyptian wife. Notice he has Egyptian children. Notice all the things that are Egyptian about him, okay? And while the tradition maintains that he had, of course, he did all the things in private, he's a Marano, basically. He's a secret Jew, according to the tradition. But in the text, on the face of it, he needs to be in Pharaoh's graces, and he will do everything he can to do that. And it's like, I mentioned this on Shabbos, there's a certain embarrassment about this. He comes from the old country, and he still eats herring, and he still eats gefilte fish when we've all advanced to poached salmon. He's still eating and doing those customs. The father's an embarrassment to him, right? The father speaks in an accent. The father wears the clothing. The father, smells of garlic. All of that is embarrassing to Joseph. John, go ahead. Unmute, you have your hand. Go ahead. John, calling on John. Yeah.
What you said about Joseph feeling about Jacob reminds me about the German Jews who came to America. Excuse me.
Came to America.
They came to America, and they were embarrassed by the East European Jews.
Sure.
And so I was thinking again, why was it that Joseph never tried to reach his father or bring his father to Egypt? And one thing occurred to me, maybe it's like the immigrant experience in America. Either the past is so painful you want to forget it, or you're embarrassed by the people from the old country. So
I think it's a combination of all of that. And I think when confronted with that, you may not get the truth. The truth may be rooted in a lot of shame. Look, it's this is a long historical discussion about America and the Holocaust, and what are the deeper truths, the shame that the American Jewish community carries with it, because knowing what they know now, that what could they have done, and that the sense of impotence in that is deeply, deeply shameful, and that feeling of shame leaves an incredible emotional shrapnel in the life of a person, and I think I would go deeply into this. What if we put Joseph on the couch here and ask him what his relationship to God and his religion is, because of what it goes both ways, by the way. It's not only did he not reach out to his father, but his father gave up on him too, and that kind of abandonment, in my rabbinical experience, there's nothing worse than that. I'm in the worst situations are parental abandonment, whether it's a father, whether it's a mother, whether it's I talk about this all the time because it's invoked in certain spiritual terms with God and God, the abandonment of God. There's nothing worse. There's just nothing worse than that. And for the child Joseph to feel that nobody's looking for me is compounded with the sense of humiliation and trauma that he must have experienced as a character and as a person, and the shame. And so all that's coming out here. It's all coming out here. And God is in there, is in the mix of this. And there's one other point, and we're out of time, but the other point is that you want to be like your father, okay? In the sense that your father had a relationship with God, but he doesn't. And so there's an aspirational element to Joseph's character, which is, I'd like to be a patriarch too. Everybody else got to be a patriarch. Look at me, I have power, I have prestige. The only thing I don't have is he never called me up. God never spoke to me. Why? And so instead of taking that dilemma and channeling it into what we would call other types of behavior, he channels it into accumulating power. And so what he says, and here this will kind of end with, he says at the end, I have all the power. We went through Jacob's blessing of the children. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. I just say here, when Jacob says to Joseph, this is the blessing that they shall have. Yisimcha Elohim ki Ephraim and Manasseh. May God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. This is, my ear catches the ironic difference between what Jacob says to Joseph's children and what Joseph says about himself. Joseph said, God made me, right? God made me a master. And Jacob is saying, may God make your children, make all the children of Israel like Ephraim and Manasseh. In other words, Jacob is equalizing the blessing among everybody. That's a complicated idea. I'll have to leave it there. But it's when Joseph says, Anochi achalkel etchem, I will sustain you, he's taking upon himself a divine power. And that occurs, it's not lost on me as a reader. And then finally, the coda of Joseph's life is God will surely take notice of you. He's at the end of his life. At the end of his life, I think there is a turning point. Okay, and this is why I'm going to take a kind of darker and also tragic view of the end of the book of Genesis, as my colleagues did with me at the last Parasha talk. And here I'm going to close this. The book ends on a sad note, which is he's in a box in Egypt as a slave, basically, and he's realizing on his deathbed that while on the one hand I brought you down to live, to save your life, on the other hand I paid a huge price for it. So I want God to redeem us. I want God, and God will redeem us, because at least I know that promise down to me. Okay, and that there's a sense that I've come to terms. I'll translate this in my language here. What Joseph would say is, I've come to terms that I'm not a patriarch. I've come to terms that God will not speak to me. I've come to terms that I'm not my father, I'm not my grandfather, I'm not my great-grandfather. I've come to terms that those were unique individuals, and that revelation, that relationship was in their life and not my life. And here I am. So what will I have? All I have is the promise that God will redeem you. And that is what I'm leaving you with. I'm leaving you with that promise. Now we head into Exodus this week with the first scene of Exodus is that the Hebrew midwives are afraid. Yarei Elohim. They're moral, okay? And then the God rewards them for being moral. And then it tells us that God will look for Moses in the fire of the bush, and God speaks to Moses. And so it's in the context of God having not had a meaningful conversation with any human being for, I don't know, a couple hundred years now, that God breaks through. And the thesis is that it's the exceptional individual, Moses, because of his exceptionality, that merits that. Joseph did not merit it, not because he wasn't exceptional in his own way. He just wasn't. He wasn't his father, wasn't his grandfather, he wasn't his great-grandfather, and he wasn't Moses. He is, though, the transitional figure with whom all of this, is required in order to get to that stop. Okay, Bob, go ahead.
So now that you've painted what for me is a very bleak picture of Joseph and all that, coming from Pirkei Avot, is there anything you can say about him that might in fact be positive? And instead of saying he's not this and not this and not this, isn't there a little bit of Abraham and Yitzhak and Jacob in him in terms of good deeds and piety, and also study, even if it's interpretation of things in life rather than prophecy? To what degree, before the Torah is giving, are they basically role modeling how one interprets the world and tries to find meaning? So I just come away with a very bleak view rather than a more integrative approach.
So I'm going to answer it off a different tack, which is, does the Torah want me to see them as role models? And of course, there is, this vein in the tradition that does want you to see them as a role model. Or, so for example, you want to see Abraham as a man of faith, but you don't want to see him as the man who kind of kicked out his son and nearly sacrificed his other, his son. You want to see Abraham as the devoted husband, but you don't want to see him as the guy who, so we have, by making them into, moral exemplars, we end up being selective in terms of reading the text. I don't have a problem with that, because we're all selective in reading the text too. We could, the challenge for me, from you, Bob, would be to come back next week and to give you the opposite lesson, and to show and to say that Joseph is a tzaddik, and I would go, look at the story. Look, he resisted Potiphar's wife. You know what it takes to resist that? That's amazing. And look at this. He was exceptional. Look at this. Wherever he was, he kept God's presence, and he was always reminded of his identity. You could make that argument there, and that is a plausible argument. I'm making the other argument.
But why not both? Why not both?
Because I'm intentionally being provocative here, in the sense that I'm playing with this idea that I think is in the text itself, which is the text remains ambiguous about it. So I'm going out completely on the ledge here on the other side, and saying if you're asking, and I'm asking this question, so what's the relationship with God between God and Joseph? I have a definitive answer for you based on this reading, which is it's not the same. It's not the same as it was with Jacob. The question of why is the question of interpretation. Why is it not the same? And I could answer it very simply and say, because that's the way it goes. Or I can say, just compare Jacob to Joseph. Lots to compare with. There's a lot of similarities. But you know what? In terms of human biography, this character, Jacob, it's just, there's, the loss of the child, the loss of the wife, the rape of the daughter, the, stealing and the birthright, the banishment, the exile, the whole catastrophe of human existence is compressed into this man's life. And it's a human life. Joseph has a human life too. It's just a different human life. When you're in power and when you're in wealth, you face life differently. Of course he suffered. Of course he's in jail, and of course that teaches him something. And that's a worthy lesson too. And I would say, so if you're asking me what's the model there, it's how does one endure in suffering? And there you could make the pious argument. Yes, by Adonai Yosef. And so he recognized that. And he recognized in those years that he was suffering, he understood that. John, go ahead.
One thing that hasn't been said here and that isn't talked about much is how Joseph uses his power over the food supply to pauperize the Egyptian people, make them literally into serfs, figuratively, I'd say into slaves.
Right.
And I wonder why that's in the Torah. Maybe the writer thought this showed what a brilliant administrator Joseph was, but it's extremely problematic. And I see in it, and I think one of your colleagues said something like this. It's kind of, I think of it's a harbinger or a foretaste of Hebrew slavery. It's kind of payback for what was done. But when you first read the story and all of a sudden you hear about what Joseph is doing with the food supply, it comes out of the left field. Why is it in the Bible? It's really bizarre.
It's bizarre, and in a way, it sets up the enmity that will take place. We don't want to justify Pharaoh's policies, but you have a small group of people, and they're identified. Joseph is identified as somewhat foreign, and so the suffering of the people has to have an outlet, and Joseph becomes the outlet on. And Pharaoh expresses that, in a later generation, they do suffer because of him. The question could be, well, what were the alternatives? What could the alternatives have been? Well, there could have been many alternatives. The welfare state is an alternative to exploitation of your citizens. And so what Joseph did was not, be munificent to them and share out the largesse of the state. He subjugated them, and he put them in, made them slaves, basically. And that's it. I'm sorry, Bob, but the book doesn't end on a high note. All right. Go ahead. Any questions? Any, Ilana? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking about what everybody said, and of course what you said. And now I'm in doubt. What does Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov have to show more for themselves to deserve to be the patriarchs more than Joseph? With all the circumstances in his life, he has a lot to show more than they did.
So that's a really good question. I could argue, well, Abraham made a transition. Abraham had to migrate. Abraham had to endure, the personal suffering of childlessness, for the course of years. And if we're reading his story in terms of, what is the expectation and promise that's been given to him, and the patience and the necessity to wait for the delivery on those promises, and loss. There's every single one of these characters experiences terrible loss. Abraham loses a brother. Abraham loses a wife. Abraham loses one son. He nearly loses a second son. These are horrendous emotional human experiences that they all endured. Isaac loses his mother, and Isaac is alone. He loses his brother. There's tremendous loneliness in him, and so they all experience deep human experiences, I would say, but they're not Joseph. Joseph's not them, and that's the truth. I'm not my father. I'm not my grandfather. None of us. We belong to our generations, and we are who we are, and although we may aspire, we I would say, we rabbis, and we kind of, we live in a kind of mythology of generations. So if you read a lot about European Jewish history and the Holocaust, which I do, you read about the world that was, okay? And it's been mythologized for us in a way that of necessity, obviously, that there's a certain piety and there was a certain excellence. This week is Abram Joshua Heschel's Yortzeit, the 50th Yortzeit of Abram Joshua Heschel. An extraordinary human being, an extraordinary teacher, an extraordinary learned, an extraordinary important philosopher, okay? And so when I went to the seminary, it was the students of Heschel were teaching us. And the subliminal message was, you're never going to be like that. You're never going to be like that. We studied with the giants, and you get to study with us, right? So there's a sense that it's not that of infantilization, but that you're minuscule. And so if you have your own self-worth, then you say, well, why can't I be that way? But then you say, I know my limitations, and I know I'm not. Okay, I think part of the generational struggle now is you take the millennials, right? And I love to criticize the millennials because they think that the world exists for them, right? They think that they know how to run everything. It's amazing to see the hubris in this generation, right? I'll close with this example, an anecdote, which is, when you interview millennials for a job, you don't ask them what their resume is. They ask you what's in it for what this job is for them. In other words, they interview you now. You don't interview them. That's where we're at. And the reason is because we've invested so much in terms of their self-esteem, their self-importance, and their power, right? They're the most powerful people because they have technology and knowledge, right? And so, here we are, we have Joseph who is, after Abraham, after Isaac, after Jacob, and has a mythology of his parents, and only wants to be like that, but he can't because he's not. All right, we got to go. Talk to you soon. See you next week. Have a good one. Bye-bye.